Welcome back to Northwest City Politics in the Know with Juanita. We're glad that you're joining us again this week. We're always happy there are people like you out there that are interested in the issues that are happening in our cities. If you haven't watched our program before, each week we'll have someone on from one of the 9 cities in CCX's viewing area who will help update us on what are the current happenings in that city council. And then from time to time, we'll have people in that affect all of our cities, which we are doing tonight. Well, I'm very happy to welcome Representative Lyndon Carlson from District 45A.
Very happy to be here.
So we're going to do work on updating those of you out there on some things in regards to the 2018 legislative session. And you've been in the legislature a long time, right?
I was elected in 1972.
Yeah. Right.
So
right.
At the current time, beginning January 1st, 2017, a year ago, I became the longest serving member.
I remember that.
As a sole member. I was tied with one other person who didn't win re-election, so got a little tenure.
Right, right. And you know that I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to our wider audience out there, because people in your district are probably familiar with you, but other people might not. Give them a little background information.
Sure. By way of background, as I just mentioned, I was elected in 1972.
Uh-huh.
And I was always very interested in government and politics and public service, and I found the legislature to be the perfect spot for me.
Right.
And it's a place where you can really have an impact and a positive one, in my view, on the citizens of the state of Minnesota and, of course, your own legislative district and area. In addition to having served in the legislature, I was a social studies teacher. Taught mainly government and economics. And sometimes I'm asked, well, how did you get so interested in politics? And I like to point to my parents. And the typical evening meal or lunch or whatever, we would always often talk about current events, current issues. And I think that kind of planted the seed. So when I started college, the courses I liked the best were those in the social sciences, and in particular economics and political science. So that ended up being my major and was good preparation for what happened a few years later when I made the decision, after being politically active in my political party and helping other candidates, to run for the Minnesota legislature. And was fortunate enough to win the first time, and have continued to do so through the years.
And maybe you can tell us 45A, I know where it is because it's part of my district, but kind of tell the cities that you're responsible for.
Well, you know, we redistrict every 10 years, so I should point out that I've at times represented other cities than what I currently represent. But after the last redistricting plan, I have about half of the city of Crystal, probably about 95% of New Hope, and then 3 precincts, or about 10,000 people in Plymouth. And a legislative district is about 40,000. And one thing I should mention probably as well, what I focus on in the legislature is often driven by the committees you're on. And I am the lead Democrat on the Ways and Means Committee. When we're in the majority, I've been fortunate enough to chair the Ways and Means Committee, or it was at one time called the Finance Committee. I serve on the Tax Committee, which establishes state tax policy, as well as the Capital Investment, or what we sometimes call the Bonding Committee. So those would be my committee assignments, and should point out that the Ways and Means Committee, we set what we call internally the targets or the budgets for each of the funding committees at the beginning of the legislative session, and then all bills that are passed from those funding committees, if they have any cost impact, ultimately go through the Ways and Means Committee before they go to the House floor. So that would be kind of my overall view of where I
right in the middle of all the action, right?
I'm related quite heavily to the budget issues.
Now, I'm going to start out with an area that we've talked a little bit before, but a lot of people out there probably aren't aware that the legislature has a 2-year time period. It's not a new one every single year.
Yeah,
and maybe you can tell what kind of actions does the legislature do during their first biennium? That's the right word, right? The first biennium, which would have been last year, because now we're at the second biennium.
We're in the second year of the biennium. Yeah, a biennium would be the 2 years.
Right.
And the first year is the longer session. We go in January and we adjourn probably the third week of May, usually May 20th, 21st, in that range. And that's when we pass the 2-year budget. We deal with major policy issues, and then we get together for the second year of the biennium, and it's usually a shorter session. And this year we're going in later than we do in most years. We go in on February 20th.
Ooh, yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that a lot of things don't happen
Oh,
in what
right,
we call
right.
the interim. Committees meet and legislation is prepared. But what I'm talking about is where you have formal floor sessions and formal committee meetings and actually pass the legislation or defeat some legislation, depending on what the situation is. But the important thing to remember is that that's a 2-year budget. But the second year, we also deal with budget issues, and usually that's for one reason or another, doing some fine-tuning, responding to an emergency, changes in federal law, things that you need to do to update the budget the second year as well.
And so this year is mainly for the budget, for the bonding, but you did do you had a year where you didn't do any bonding and then you had to kind of make it up, so it's sort of a little out of...
Yeah, this is the second time that we've been in a major way out of sync. Probably 20 years ago or so it happened as well. But last biennium, we didn't pass a bonding bill. And so the first year of this biennium, we did pass a bonding bill that would have normally passed a year earlier. So we have a unique situation where we'll be passing 2 major bonding bills in all likelihood, one each year of this biennium.
And then, just as a side note, what do you think the public should expect to see when they come to the newly redone Capitol building?
A lot more public space.
Okay.
A couple of things about the building. You know, it's over 100 years old.
Yes.
And you'd be surprised at the amount of soot and dirt and so on that accumulated on the artwork in the building. And one of the first things that you notice if you've been in the Capitol in recent years and you were to go and visit again now is how bright a lot of those paintings and murals are, because they've all been cleaned and touched up. There had been some water damage with some of them, and that's all been taken care of. A lot of the offices that were in the Capitol were moved to the new Senate office building. I'm in a different building that was built many years ago. But that freed up a lot of space for public use in the Capitol. So that's another thing that you will notice. But one of the really important things is that the integrity of the building is protected. There were a lot of leaks, a lot of damage to the exterior just through time. And all of that has been redone, and they had just excellent crafts people that were able to redo a lot of that. And so it's like a brand new building. And then there's behind the scene things that you wouldn't notice, but your comfort level would be a lot better because there's an entirely new HVAC, heating and air system. You know, all that was literally ancient technology, and that's all been modernized. And from the taxpayer's perspective, over the years, much more efficient than what the old system was. So to heat and cool that building will be a lot more cost effective than it was with the old system.
Well, and instead of going into some specific areas first, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit, because there's concerns about the end of the legislative session, when major bills get stalled or they get passed with not very much time to look at them. And it's at that point, then there's a few top players that get to make decisions. Can you comment about this, and are there any efforts underway to make changes?
Well, there's been a lot of concern by members as well as the public about what you're describing there, where major bills come up right near the end of the session,
Right.
and there's always the question about whether the public has had a chance to appropriately review and comment on
Sure.
those bills. One of the solutions that I've advocated for some time, and I think is now at the point where it's probably going to happen, is that we have earlier deadlines. So that those bills, and what we're talking about are conference committees,
Right,
where
right.
the House has passed a bill, the Senate has passed a bill, and then you're working out the differences,
Right.
and that's what comes back at the last minute. And it's not that a lot of members don't know what's in those bills, because they
right,
passed
right.
one body
I mean,
or
they've
another.
been working through them.
But if there were compromises and so on in certain issues, a lot of times the public will say, well, gee, what happened to this or that issue?
Yeah.
Or I thought that the language that had passed the House or passed the Senate was going to be in the bill, and it's no longer there. That sometimes happens where it gets dropped out for one reason or another. And so to have an earlier deadline, I think, would be a way of providing more transparency in the
right.
lawmaking process. Historically, there's been a certain amount of brinkmanship.
Oh, yeah.
Conference committee meets, governor weighs in, wants changes in the bills or some of the governor's initiatives
Right.
included in the bills. And so a lot of that brinkmanship takes place because the deadline right now is the constitutional deadline of when you need to adjourn. So
Right.
if you move that back, let's say a couple of weeks,
Right.
where the deadline was that those bills had to be out of conference committee under House and Senate rules, what we call joint rules.
Right.
That would give the public an opportunity
Right.
to review those bills. And some of the members that may not have been on some of those key
Oh,
committees
right,
would
right,
have an opportunity
right.
to review them as well.
Oh, so that's interesting to hear. Hope it happens, right?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
You know.
Now, another area, before we get to the specifics, would be that legislators keep in contact with people in their area, but also that's a way of learning what are important issues and moving them into a law. Individual people have a difference with their House of Representatives.
Well, I think what you're asking is what's the best way
Right.
to, if you're following the legislature, to keep in touch or to find out what's
Right.
going on. Locally, what we do in our district, and we've done that ever since I was elected, we have a town hall meeting.
Right.
In fact, years ago, we used to call it the legislative breakfast. And literally, it was a breakfast meeting, Dutch treat. But in recent years, we gather either at the library or Crystal City Hall, because that's the center
Right.
of our district. But once in a while, the other city halls. And we have a town hall meeting. We advertise it, invite the public to come in. We give a legislative update, and just to open it up from that point forward with whatever anybody wants to ask about
Sure.
or comment on. And that's one way you get a pretty good feel of what people are interested in the community. We get invited to attend a lot of different community events.
Oh, sure.
And serve on a panel or serve on a given committee. And that's another way that you keep in touch. The individual, and here's something that has changed from when I was first elected.
Okay.
We used to get a lot of typewritten, handwritten communications from constituents. Very little of that anymore. In fact, we used to get a lot of phone calls. Very few phone calls today, very few typewritten or handwritten letters. It's all email.
Right.
In fact,
right.
I tell people when I'm asking that or ask that question before groups, I'll say, if you want your letter or message to really stand out, maybe write a personal note,
Right,
because
right.
that kind of jumps out. It's not
Sure,
in
because
that
they don't see it.
list of emails.
Right.
And the nice thing about emails, of course, is that an individual can contact several legislators.
Oh, right.
The old system, you had to put the stamp on each and every one, and if you were going to contact all 201 legislators,
that'd be a lot.
which is what some people do today
sure.
now with email, be a little costly. So those are some of the ways that you do it. And another way is that I would be an advocate for, being that we're in a political year, get active in the political party of your choice.
Right.
And you will meet the candidates, you'll meet the incumbent office holders if they're running for re-election. And that's another way of kind of making contacts. So there's that personal touch where you get to know people. And the other thing is that the citizens can do, and the cities are very interested in this, and we have some of these at the state level, various boards and commissions that you can volunteer for and be involved in your community. Or we have what we call the open appointments process for the state, and they have a lot of special committees and boards and so on where they're soliciting commission or citizen input. And that's another way you can influence legislation. And you can come over and testify.
Right.
I like to tell a story. When I chaired the education committee a few years ago, we were on TV, and there was a fellow who lived in St. Paul, and he was watching us, and he had something important to say, and he hopped in his car and he drove over. And I got a note that this fellow was in the audience and he wanted to comment. We had time. So all of a sudden he's watching TV. A few minutes later he's sitting up in front of about 30 legislators testifying on the issue that he was interested in. So that's another way that you can keep in touch, is a lot of our meetings are televised. And not everybody jumps in the car and comes over immediately, but he was interested enough where he did.
Well, and sometimes that gives you the direct contact then that might help your idea along.
Yes, that's very true.
And now, how can the average citizen out there keep track of what's happening in any given area?
Probably, well, there's several ways to do it, but one of the key ways is the House and Senate have their website, and you can go to that website. It's very simple. You can just, for example, type in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and both the House and Senate will pop up, and they will list the committee hearings, what the agendas are, what the bills are that are going to be up on the House floor. If you don't know who your legislator is, there's a questionnaire, who's my legislator, and you can type in your address and zip code and the name of your legislator, and how you contact them will pop up. So there's a lot of information on that website, including looking at the actual copies of the bills that are under consideration. So there's just a lot of ways to do it with the world of technology as it is now. If you've got access to a computer, or you can even, in some instances, if you don't, go over to the local library if you really wanted to look something up or find out the language in a bill. And we get calls from constituents who will say, gee, I'm interested in House File whatever. Could you send me a copy of it? Or could you email me a copy of the bill? So that's another way to do it, in addition to the House and Senate websites.
Yeah, and all these different opportunities are important for legislators to hear from people, right?
Oh yes, that's vitally important. And you know, I know for a fact when you have a committee hearing, sometimes if it's an issue that's quite fluid, that testimony will sway legislators or a committee or an individual on the committee in terms of how they ultimately vote on a bill, or maybe they'll listen to the testimony and somebody's hand will go up and they'll say to the chair of the committee, I'd like to propose an amendment. And that amendment might have been in part due to testimony or an email or something from a constituent. The other thing that happens is that constituents give you ideas for legislation. And sometimes at one of the town hall meetings, somebody will come up after the meeting or maybe even during the meeting and say, you know, I've got an idea for a bill that should be repealed, or a law that should be repealed, or a bill that should be introduced on a given subject. And so there's a lot of vehicles in terms of how you can access the legislative process and have an impact.
So we'll hope that the people out there, if they have an issue they're really concerned about, to follow through in any one of those ways.
Yes, and I Well, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
I've been involved locally on a committee dealing with early childhood education. It's a citizens group, and I've been quite interested in early childhood education. So I'm really there. I kind of look at it with my citizen hat on, but you don't totally separate your legislative hat either.
Right.
And so I've learned a lot about early childhood education by participating, and that's made up of a group of citizens that are interested in that topic. I remember years ago, one of the very first bills that I introduced, I was on the Health and Human Services Committee, and a fellow sent me a letter, because we didn't have email, of course, back then, and he expressed concern that when you took certain medications, that they would impair your ability to drive.
Right.
And the doctor wouldn't have warned you, the pharmacist wouldn't have warned you. And so I introduced a bill, and ultimately we ended up with, that's where you have the warning label on prescription drugs. Right. That's an example of one that came from a constituent. It wasn't an idea that I could claim that I had, but I thought he had a good argument. Right. Well, then the question comes, well, who testifies for a bill? Quite honestly, the first time I brought the bill up, it was defeated. And the second time I got a hold of a fellow that was a captain in the highway patrol. And he testified in favor of the bill, and he said something like, there's probably not a highway patrolman in the state of Minnesota that hasn't pulled somebody out of a car, either dead or injured, that innocently took some medication and perhaps fell asleep at the wheel, and just didn't know that there was that kind of a risk. So that came from a citizen many years ago. That's a law that's still there. And if you look carefully at certain labels when you get a prescription, that warning will be there.
Right, I remember that.
I could go through quite a list. I got very involved a few years ago in alternative energy, and got a lot of feedback from constituents about how the state of Minnesota should begin to help develop wind energy. And I have to say I was quite involved, and was on the conference committee and so on when we started the first development out in southwestern Minnesota on what they call Buffalo Ridge for the generation of electric power using wind. And actually it's really not wind. I maybe have mentioned this before because you and I have talked about it, but it's a natural uplift of the air off the Great Plains, and so it's kind of like what pilots... It's
always there,
Yeah, what pilots would talk about when they're flying with a jet stream. And so it's fairly, or it is quite constant.
In that part of the state.
And but now they've got the technology to the point where places that weren't as viable, let's say 25 years ago, are viable now today. So you'll see these windmills popping up in different places.
Well, now moving into a different area, and I don't know that it's necessarily the beginning, but that there's a legislative budget forecast that's done a couple of times, and I thought maybe you could talk about that, the two different times and how it affects what the legislature will do.
Sure. We just had one, and it was called the November forecast, is the way it's referred to. And by way of a little background, there are 2 House members and 2 senators that we get to sit in and listen, not participate, we just listen. And it's the chair and the ranking minority member, which is my role currently, on the Ways and Means Committee, and then our counterparts in the Senate. And it's a group of about 10 economists. Federal Reserve is represented, some economists from some of our higher education institutions, some economists that come from the private sector as well. And they talk about the economy and what the impact might be on housing starts, what the impact on the budget as a result of housing starts, or the lack of investments in certain sectors of our economy, how well agriculture is doing, and so on. And we have a state economist that listens to all that, participates in the discussions. We're observing that, and by the way, we're told that we should not go out and share it before they release their final report. what the results of those discussions are. And so not even the governor knows. He has staff there,
Right.
but you're not supposed to share what you hear about the economy. Well, they massage all of that, and then they come up with the forecast.
Right.
And they apply our fiscal laws to what they see happening with our economy. And that forecast in November, I call it the benchmark,
Right.
because we're not in session, but it kind of lets you know how you're doing. The second forecast, when you mentioned that there are two, is the February forecast, which comes out early March. And that's the one that we actually build the budget on.
Right.
And what they're doing is forecasting on into the future. And they will forecast what will happen, the balance of this biennium, and then give us some benchmarks for the future biennium. So we're out, in this case, this forecast will put us out about 3 years. And you have to, twice each year, look at and make adjustments and so on. But that's kind of the behind the scenes, how the budget is put together. And sometimes they're amazingly close. Sometimes something will happen with the economy unexpectedly, and that's when you read about maybe there's a lot of red ink. This past November forecast, we were down about 183 million.
Okay. What's the total budget?
46 billion. So that kind of gives you an idea. That's an important number, but you do have to put it against the $46 million state budget. That's the general fund is what we're talking about. So that will be one of the issues that we could be working on come the session that begins February 20th. Now, it's possible that the new forecast in February, that might disappear. I'll give you an example. One of the things that creates part of that problem, about 175 million of that 188 million, is the children's health insurance, what we call CHIP. And that's federal dollars that didn't come in. So if those federal dollars were to come in, and they were supposed to pass that last September on the federal level, but if they do pass that before we go into session, that would pretty well wipe out that deficit. But when they go out 3 years, we've got over a $500 million problem when you get into the next biennium. So there's going to have to be some careful planning unless we really have a pickup with our economic growth that would wipe that out.
All right, we've touched on a lot of issues. There are other ones out there that I'm sure will also arise, but we've run out of time. So I want to thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome. I always enjoy it.
Bringing all this information for our audience out there so they'll know what to kind of look for. And if they're really concerned, know that there's all those different ways to get in touch with their legislators. And we hope you'll tune in next week for part 2 on the legislative issues. We're glad that you've been with us and hope you rejoin us again.